Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us when the sun's shining outside. We're pleased to welcome Valentina Trudeau's for this evening's webinar. And I also have joining me this evening my colleagues Claire Howard, the Vice Principal, and Calvin Liu, our School Counsellor. So for the next 4 to 5 minutes or so, Valentina will provide knowledge and insight about talking to teenagers about sex. This webinar was one of the most requested by parents to return because I'm guessing in an increasingly sexualised world, how do we educate young people and importantly, keep them safe? And as parents, navigating the awkwardness can be challenging. We've received lots of questions in advance, which Valentina has incorporated into her presentation, but we will have some time for Q&A at the end. At this point, I'll hand over to Valentina. Thank you.
Thank you, Saf. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here again, and always I'm enjoying spending time with both the students and the parents of West Island School. So as you mentioned, today we're going to talk about touching on this rather awkward topic of talking to teenagers about sex. So I'm going to share a little presentation that will allow all of you to follow me on what I actually am presenting today. So first of all, I would like to introduce myself a little bit. The reason why I am here is because I am a sex coach and a relationship coach. I work with a lot of adults and also teenagers on all matters of breakups, sex, relationships, dating and relationship skills. And in fact, I have been invited many times by the West Island School to give a lot of classes on consent and sexuality for students, which you may have heard about from your own children. So today, let's talk to the parents. Let's look at the parents' perspective. And I would like to start by saying that ultimately sex is a very natural part of being human. It's obviously the reason we are all here as people, because our parents had some sex at some point in their life. And the reason you are here because you are parents and therefore you've had to have some sexual interaction. So we can all start with this maybe agreement or alignment point that ultimately it's a part of life that we cannot escape or avoid. But what tends to happen is that we avoid talking about it. So not only should we have more sex for various reasons of intimacy and connection, but we should also learn to talk more about it in a more natural way. So the key point that I want to make today is, first of all, to understand where does this embarrassment come from when we all experience a little resistance in talking about sex with our teenagers or children, or even with our friends, and why do we have to overcome it? And also, obviously, the how, because it's great to say, okay, I want to be more open about it and I want to talk about it in a more open fashion, but how am I going to do it? So what I'm going to talk about today is very practical. First of all, giving you an overview of this whole conversation, and then go into specific tools that you can use to explore sexuality with your teenage daughter or son. So the first thing I would like to say is that ultimately sex education starts at home. And it starts, in fact, much earlier than the age of puberty. Like a lot of times we think that at some point when our children reach a certain age, we need to have the talk with them. But I would like to maybe help you reframe this idea that there is one conversation that will solve all the problems and that will educate your teen on matters of consent and how they should feel, what is their sexual identity, and how exactly they're meant to navigate this new world of intimacy and relationships. So I guess the premise of this whole conversation would be for all of us to figure out a way to talk about sex and sexuality in the same way as we educate our children about all the other things that we teach them as they're growing up. Just as we teach our children to brush their teeth and to shower and to eat healthy food, all these topics are very easy for us to address, right? If your child is sick, if they have a runny nose, it would be no problem for you to actually discuss this situation with them, how they may have caught a cold or how to keep themselves safe from germs in the future and so on. And yet when it comes to sex, which is an equally natural thing that happens to us, we find that is a little bit or quite a lot more awkward. So when I say that the sex education starts at home, I will like to invite you to remember that, in fact, a conversation about sex has started a very long time ago. In reality, it's not just one conversation that you are having. So how does it start? Well, this awkwardness that you may be feeling around the topic of sexuality is something that your child has learned to notice even from the very early days of their life, right? Because when we are young, we are not necessarily understanding the words. The way we learn about life experience is we see something on the outside of ourselves in our environment. We then maybe learn a word that describes the way we feel about it. So children usually pay a lot more attention to the emotional state of the people around them than they do to the actual words that those people around them are using. So even if you've completely avoided talking to your children about their genitals, you've not used the anatomically correct words, you've already told your children that there is something to be ashamed of when it comes to sexuality, that there's something that they are not supposed to talk about. Because in those times when we're telling our child, okay, this is your nose, but that other part of your body, we don't really want to name with the name that everyone can talk about, they understand that there's something that it's not really very okay socially to mention. Of course, yes, we need to teach our children how to protect their privacy, how to not allow everyone to touch them in ways that make them feel uncomfortable. But if we operate too much from a place of fear, shame, guilt, or awkwardness, this is exactly how children are going to experience this. So it really starts ultimately, this whole conversation, or the change that needs to happen for you to have this conversation in a way that is productive and positive. It starts with maybe a little bit of self-reflection. So self-reflection in terms of what is your own attitude towards sexuality? Were you told when you were growing up that sex is something bad, it's a sin, that's something you should refrain from until you're ready? Well, first of all, how are we supposed to know when we're ready for something that we've never done before and nobody talks about? Secondly, you might have had this idea that if there is too much open conversation about sex and sexuality around youngish children, it might feel like an encouragement for them to have sex, to be sexual. But it really doesn't, it's not at all like that. If children are kept in the dark and they are experiencing physical sensation, they experience desire, they experience attraction, but they already made the conclusion that all of this is wrong, even though they don't really know what's wrong with it, what's wrong about it, it will make them feel stupid, it will make them feel different, it will make them feel abnormal, because they will have this impression that everyone else knows stuff that they don't know, and they can only make the conclusion that there's something wrong with them, that the problem is actually themselves, not other people. So it is almost our responsibility as adults to become more comfortable in ourselves in the way that we think and we feel about sexuality, so that then we can present accurate and factual information to our children and people who are young people who are surrounding us, so that they become comfortable with their own sexuality. So let's move to maybe how you have experienced this, the idea of sex education. At least in my time, it was not quite like this. I wasn't really being threatened with dying. But one of the reasons why I chose not to get married and I chose not to become a mother is as a child growing up, I was being told all the time by my father, don't get married, don't get pregnant. Now, in my culture, getting married meant if I had sex, the person who I had sex with would have been compelled to marry me, because that's kind of how it worked. Unfortunately, that program is still extremely powerful in my head. And, even though I help a lot of people get happy relationships, it still represents a bit of an emotional issue for me. So I'd like you to consider what kind of conversations have been happening in your life for the duration of your children's life. What do you think is their opinion about sex? How do they think about sex? And I'd like to tell you a little story here of a client who's like maybe in her 20s that I am actually working with at the moment, who suffers of a condition called vaginismus. Vaginismus is basically an ability to have penetrative sex because her vaginal muscles are contracting and keeping everything outside, and it's extremely painful. When I explored with her, where did she have this idea that is going to hurt? She told me that from very early on, maybe when she was 6 or 7, her father told her that sex is a horrible experience and it's very, very painful. So in this young lady's head, sex has always been associated with pain, with something disgusted, with something hurtful. And therefore, as a result of that conversation and a few other events that have happened in her life by which she isn't comfortable with her own body, she is essentially incapable of having a normal, healthy relationship with her partner. So let's really maybe reframe. I'd like to reframe the concept of sex, right? If you have been told that sex is bad, it's a sin, it's something terrible that we are never prepared for. This pyramid here is essentially the pyramid of needs. And you will see that at the very bottom of this pyramid, it's listed, sex is listed in physiological needs, the most fundamental needs that we experience: food, water, warmth, sleep, expression, and sex. Well, in children, of course, we're not going to encourage children to have sex, and not because it's something unnatural for them to do, but because sex comes with a lot of emotional implications, and children do not have the emotional landscape prepared for that yet. And this is the work that we need to do, essentially. When we're educating our children that sex is a natural, very, very desirable activity, something that is part of being human, we're actually teaching them that it's absolutely necessary to, or it's actually very possible to feel good. So first of all, if we actually told our children that sex is something horrible and that they might get pregnant and it's all fear-based, they will actually associate this activity with something that they need to avoid, or something that will really get them in trouble, so to speak. So before I go into explaining how we can avoid that situation and how we can position sex as something that needs to be done in the right way at the right time, I would like to mention a little bit this idea of the source of this embarrassment that we're feeling. So ultimately, we are educated about sex by our own parents, right? And we may have already taken some measures to transport, if you like, our children in the same space of shame, fear, of guilt. So let's give you an example. Is if any of you have had the experience of finding your very young child playing with their genitals from a very young age and didn't know what to do. You may have freaked out, you may have scolded them for doing something wrong, you may have forbidden them to touch themselves or to talk about that incident, because obviously there is the natural fear of them putting themselves in an embarrassment situation. Then already you have created some sort of association, a negative association between the idea of sex and self-exploration, self-pleasure in your child's mind. And ultimately that happened potentially because you have been conditioned by the society, by your parental background, their values, by the kind of socioeconomic position where you were born, to believe that children touching themselves or exploring their bodies is something wrong that should never happen, and therefore you have transmitted that same message to your child. Obviously, your child would have experienced the same shame as you have. So avoiding this situation will really be potentially resolved by understanding your own limitations, your own upbringing, if you like. Where did you learn about sex? So if you want to overcome this situation, this attitude that you have, maybe there is an opportunity for you to learn more about sexuality in general. And I know a lot of parents have asked in the past, what are some resources on how can we educate our children better? Well, I'd like to explain a little bit more about this concept of social learning theory and why this process may have already started, and now we need to do some conscious work to change some of the associations that were created in a child's mind. So first of all, understanding how we learn, especially when we're very young, we observe, right? And children observe everything that happens around them. They're very, very curious. I'm sure that when your children were young, they asked about a lot of things and you remember that. But their mental state, both of the person who asked the question and the mental state of the person who educates, who explains that, the answer is really, really important, because like I said, the child would very much pay attention to the mental state and the emotional state of the speaker and absorb not only the verbal information, the actual instructions that were given to them. You shouldn't do this, or this is forbidden, don't let people touch you there, this is bad, but also the emotion that was associated with that. So now that all of this is very much in the subconscious, if you like, what we need to do is bring all of these activities more into the conscious, so that we change this attitude that we have, if you like, unconsciously communicated to our child, that there was something wrong with it. So being more sex positive, being more open is what really needs to happen. So before I did all of this preamble because I wanted you to understand how important it is that you become comfortable with this as much as possible, that you shift yourself from this space where sex is something weird, awkward, bad, sinful, something that makes you feel guilty or ashamed, into a space where you are simply educating your child how to be experiencing intimacy, how to experience pleasure, desire later on in life. Your role as a parent, at least the way I see it, is to educate our children to have the best possible life. So if for some reason, a child has experienced this negative emotion when they heard conversations about sex, if the emotional, let's say, tone of that conversation was about shame, embarrassment, or fear, this will create discomfort inside their own body and mind. And when we feel discomfort, our brain and body is absolutely wired to avoid that situation. So if you've had the experience where your child avoids conversations about sex, even if you've tried to say, hey, do you want to learn more about this? Because all they remember is that association between, shame or guilt or embarrassment, they will not be very open to discuss this. So if we already know that they have an association with something bad, this is our mind operates exactly like a computer. If one set of input is present, then a certain given consequence will create an output. So if your child feels discomfort around anything to do with sexuality, they will definitely want to go away from it, to avoid as much as possible experiencing that uncomfortable feeling. So the first rules, if you like, of talking about sexuality is to try to be as truthful and as direct in your answers with your children. Because the reason, like I mentioned, they are maybe feeling a little bit or very, very embarrassed about it is because they've picked it up and they just don't feel that they can trust this conversation will end up being at least neutral, if not very pleasurable. So the second thing that is really important to remember is that there is actually no difference in real factual terms, without the judgment and the feelings, in talking to your child about the kind of food that they are better served by eating, more vegetables, less sugar, less chocolate. So it's exactly the same thing. The need for food and the need for intimacy are literally on the same level in our body. So now I'm going to go into the tools, into the protocols, or I don't like to call it advice, but just some suggestions of how you can really approach this conversation. So basically, like I said, in the first decade or the first 2 decades of our lives, our brains are literally programmed and shaped with the knowledge and information that is stored in there. So literally our brain gets more complicated, more complex through our experiences. And the first time that we experience something, like I said, our brain cells literally fire together in a pattern. And whether if that pattern generates a pleasurable experience, like something that we want more of, then we will continue to seek that experience, and that brain pattern will become stronger, which means, think about eating something that we like. The first time we like chocolate is like our mind is blown by the sweetness and the beauty of that taste. So we're going to want more of that chocolate. However, if we eat something that gives us a really horrible feeling or makes us sick, we will avoid that whole experience again. It's just basic neuroscience and brain chemistry. So I've talked at length about your attitude to how to do this, but now let's talk in practical terms. So I can assume, or I will assume as a starting point, that maybe your children will not be very keen on discussing sex. Very few of them might come to you and say, hey, mom and dad, I want to talk about sex with you, just because they've already been programmed to associate sex with something unpleasant, the stick in the picture here on the screen. So, of course, if the children are going to be avoiding this conversation, you've been avoiding it, but then both of you really have experienced a negative feeling in that interaction. So now what we need to do is kind of find a way to create a new association in your child's brain, something that doesn't scare them, something that doesn't make them feel uncomfortable. So it's really creating a brand new experience here. So we can start by saying, okay, I know we've not talked about these things, and it may feel a little bit awkward for both of us. And, you could possibly know quite a lot of things about this subject, but what I really would like to tell you is that I'm here and ready to answer these questions in every way that I can. So this reassurance basically sets the pace for the mind, the child's mind, the teenager's mind to start experiencing something new, to say, oh, okay, maybe my parent is actually going to say something that I care about. So just to understand how this pleasure and pain buttons work, if you like, in our brain, and how we can change how we can shift this dynamic from the association that may have been created in your child's mind, which is here on the right, which is essentially the rule or the cultural programming which said that sex is something to do with discomfort, is pain, is punishment. By our brain, it gets interpreted as a threat. And if we feel threatened by something, we're going to want to avoid that experience, or we're going to want to hide. So if this is the child's mindset around the idea of sex, if they see this conversation as a potential threat, they are going to simply push you away and say, no, I'm not interested, I already know. Now, what we need to do is to kind of change the balance a little bit towards not necessarily, let's say, encouraging your child to have sex, but what we really need to do as educators is allow your child to create their own experience of sex as something that is a reward, that is pleasurable. And what I mean by sex, I don't mean the actual physical sex of, copulation, right? I'm talking about the idea of sex and sexuality, and exploring sexuality, and loving their body, and loving the sensations that they receive from their body. Because ultimately, one day, even though right now you're telling your daughters that they are not supposed to be dating because dating is bad for them, one day you're going to start asking them, why aren't you getting married? Why don't you have a boyfriend? Why don't you have children? And I can tell you from my work with adults who have been told these messages, this is exactly why they don't feel accomplished and they don't feel like they can be good enough, because maybe that's not what they actually wanted. So if we want to change the conversation, the emotional environment of the conversation about sex, from something that feels like a threat to something like that feels that it's okay to pursue, to something that, it's instinctive, it's natural, is irresistible. We all need sex in our life. Both for personal reasons and social reasons. So we kind of need to really figure out how to change this balance so that the children, the teenagers, and yourself feel more comfortable with this conversation. So we literally need to shift from threat to something that it's okay to pursue. So I like to offer you a psychological model that is called the SCARF model. So I'm going to talk about the model a little bit, and then I'm going to give you very specific examples of how to use this model to motivate your child to go towards this opportunity that you are offering to receive positive and supportive sex education versus thinking that you are absolutely not the person that they can have this conversation with. Therefore, they see this situation of talking to you about sex as a threat, because as these two arrows are showing you, once we perceive something as a threat, we want to run away from it as far as possible. So let's explain. I'll go through the individual things. So SCARF is an abbreviation. It stands for these 5 things that are really, really important for every human being and in every situation of our life that helps us to move towards something, like to pursue certain things in social interaction versus avoiding them. So the first thing that matters is status. What is my position in relation to other people? So if your child has been hearing a lot of, oh, well, I'm the adult, I know better, you're just a child, if they feel dismissed, if they feel like their opinion doesn't matter, especially as they get into their teenage years, into puberty, where they think they're so grown up that they know, they're starting to have opinions that matter. If they're constantly being put in their corner and treated like children, this is going to be a major threat for them. So then if they constantly feel like their opinion doesn't matter, they're not going to want to listen to you out of sheer rebellion. They're just going to want to be as far away from you as possible, because you are not fulfilling, you are not giving them this sense of, okay, I matter, I'm not just a child. Certainty is really about trust, about knowing that the future is going to be something pleasurable. Now we are wired for disaster, so our brain is constantly trying to predict the worst possible outcome. So if the child already knows that previous conversations about sex have led to discomfort and difficulty and awkwardness, or maybe punishment and being scolded and being grounded for being caught that they were doing something bad, they're almost, the certainty is in this case a negative element, because it will continue to push them away from you. So what you want to do is reassure the children, reassure the teens that it's okay, that they can trust that they are not going to be punished, that they are not going to be told off, that they can actually come to you with their legitimate questions so that they feel safe and they feel like they really have an ally in yourself. Autonomy provides all of us a sense that, we have some sort of control in our life. When we're children, obviously, this is something that we're constantly striving to have. And you may have experienced this from the days when your child was 2 years old, when you started saying no. What the child was trying to establish was autonomy, to say, no, I'm not your puppet. I'm doing things that I want. This is true not just for humans, but it's true even for animals and pets that we have. So really, while you do not want to give your child free rein to do whatever they want, you need to provide a space in which the child feels they have autonomy in certain areas of their life that are safe for them, so that they understand where the boundaries are. The R stands for relatedness, and relatedness is again this sense that we belong in our community, that we are accepted. So there's 2 things that we actually want in life. We want love and acceptance, and we need to see that the people around us, especially the people that we love, accept us and they make us feel safe. So if they cannot relate to you, if they feel like excluded because they've done something that is perceived as being bad, they're not going to feel very comfortable to have these conversations, and therefore they're not going to come towards you as the solution to their problem. And the F in SCARF stands for fairness. Fairness is a perception of fair exchanges about people. I'm sure you've heard your child said many, many times, oh, but this is not fair. Why are you making me do this? And you're not making my younger brother do this. So children are extremely sensitive to fairness. For them, it's so important that things that happen to them have to be fair, because it just gives them a measure of their value, if you like, that they are actually being considered as valuable. So you will get a copy of this whole presentation anyway. And I wanted to explain this in detail. So now let's talk about specifically, how can we apply the SCARF model in talking to children about sex? So there's two ways we can do it, right? So we can give messages that continue to make our children feel that this conversation is going to be a threat, or that there's something painful about it. So for example, we could give them instructions. Oh, never masturbate again, or don't watch porn, or if I catch you doing, texting your friends late at night, I'm going to do something. So this is clearly a threat, right? When we're giving them instructions, when we're scolding them, when you say, oh, this is what happened to a friend of mine when I was a kid, or if you're just telling them you are just a kid, you're essentially killing this aspect of status, of their position in your life, their ability to mean something. So if this has been the way they've perceived your conversations in this kind of space, in order to make this conversation more productive, you're going to need to shift from this stick to the carrot. And the carrot would be conversations that come from this position. Thank you for coming to me. I really appreciate you telling me this. I really appreciate that you're asking for my support. I am here with whatever you want. So I understand that naturally it might not be very easy for you in case there is some sort of crisis. If your child comes and says, "Oh my God, this happened to me. Some boy touched me in a horrible way." Sure, you could freak out and say, "Oh my God, how could you do this? That is terrible. You're grounded." Or you can say, "Oh, thank you so much for coming to me. I really am here trying, and I am here to support you. Let's work on this together." Now, certainty, talking about their ability to predict the future and to predict a positive outcome, would be, if you want to do it in a positive way, using the carrot model, you can just say to your child, "Okay, let's make a pact. From now on, I'm changing the way that I am. I'm really trying to be as open about this as possible. Let's make an agreement or a pact. And anytime you have any questions about relationships, about dating, about anything to do with boys or girls, please be open and tell me, and I will be as open as transparent about my feelings as well." What is really, really important is that you validate their feelings, that everything they see, hear, experience is absolutely valid. You may not agree with it, but that is not the point. You can educate them through this positive reinforcement much better than through scolding, judging, acting hurt or disappointed, blaming them, or not trusting them, like grounding them or trying to control their phones or limit their screen time or what they are doing. If you're actually asking them what motivates them to do this and validating their feelings, knowing, I understand that all of this information, all of this stuff is present on Instagram and social media everywhere around us. I know it's really confusing and very difficult to deal with this. Let me try to help you. I am here for you. You can come to me with anything that you are really looking to find out. When it comes to autonomy, what's really important is that you'll have very clear boundaries about what's okay and what's not okay. For example, if you're worried that your child may be watching too much porn and they may be getting addicted to it, you can negotiate with your child that, they understand how damaging that can be for them, and you can negotiate a win-win solution. For example, they can only access the computer in the living room together with everyone else. Or also understand that, if they're 16, 17, they will most likely watch porn whether you like it or not. But if you have younger children in the household who may be using the same devices, you can enlist the help of your teen to protect the younger children. It may not be something that you feel very comfortable with, but in reality, knowing and having access and the ability to not control, but to support your teen in exploring this area of their life is a much better way forward than trying to block them. So asking for their opinions, being flexible about the way things are done is a way more positive, way more encouraging or empowering way of doing it. So also by giving them this information and giving them access to to solid positive resources about sexuality, for example, giving them books to read or articles that you found very interesting and informative, you are empowering your team to make their own decisions, therefore supporting their desire for autonomy, which means that they will be much more inclined to have these kind of conversations with you and learn to trust you. Relatedness, if you keep reinforcing the generational gap, if you keep saying, oh, when I was your age, we didn't do things like this, you are just creating distance, and you are positioning yourself as a threat to them, as someone who cannot understand them or accept them for who they are. Someone who has never been a teenager, you know, obviously our teens never can imagine us having had the same experiences as them. So one way of creating relatedness or empowering or let's say facilitating this in your child is to really explain to your teenager that, you know, we've all been there, we've all had our heart broken, we've all had maybe some wandering hands that we didn't know how to deal with, and so on. So really connecting with your team on a human level, you know, not necessarily from an authority perspective, but to say, yeah, I know how you feel, let's work on how we can find a solution for this. And then fairness, of course, if you are not supporting your child, if they don't know what's okay, what's not okay, if you have very high expectations of purity when that's really against nature, if you're constantly punishing, criticizing them, grounding them, restricting access to friends and phone because of some sort of sexual transgression that they made, they will never want to have these conversations openly with you. So really consider how you can bring more transparency in your relationship with your teen, how you can have calm and direct communication, encouraging them to open up. Again, recognize that it's perfectly normal to have these experiences. It's normal for them to want to masturbate. It's normal for them to feel attraction for another person, whatever, same sex or opposite sex. You know, it is very possible they might experience feelings of attraction towards a person of their own sex and gender because they are just in the process of creating a sense of identity for themselves. So I know this is a lot. You will have this, like I said, in an actual PDF later, so you can refer back to it. So let's move on and get even more specific about these things. And, you know, I want to create a framework here where we're no longer referring to this conversation as the talk. It doesn't have, it's not one-off, basically. That's what I'm trying to say. You're not going to sit your team down and say, okay, right, now we're going to talk about sex and I'm going to tell you everything you ever wanted to know, because they're probably going to run away for the reasons that I've mentioned all this time. So it's more about talking about sex in general, openly and as directly as possible. So I know some of the questions that came back was like, well, when is a good time? How do I do this? For me, the favorite way of doing it is experiencing everyday teaching moments. So every experience that you're sharing with your teen can be an opportunity to talk about sex. One of the questions that I received was, you know, how do I stop my child from watching Netflix shows that have a lot of sex scenes? In fact, don't. Watch those shows with your teen. Talk about what they're seeing. Talk about the situations that the actors are experiencing on the screen, and just get how does your teen feel about it. Also share how you're feeling about this. You know, maybe it makes you terribly uncomfortable to see people having sex on the screen, and that's why you are trying to avoid them. It's very, very normal for you to find articles touching on these kind of subjects and sharing it with your parents. I don't know how you've been educated, each and every one of you, about sex. I know my parents didn't really talk to me about sex, but the one thing that I've always appreciated is my mom gave me a book called Sexology, which was literally like a university manual on sexuality. And I really got a lot of my basic, you know, functional, if you like, and practical, not practical in terms of how to have sex, but to understand sexuality as being something absolutely normal. One thing that I've mentioned, and I will mention again, if something happens in your teen's life that you feel is wrong or is going against your values, if you start lecturing them, if you start judging them, you are blocking this process and you are creating more this sense of threat. So here in these kind of situations, it's really important to really focus on your team's feelings. How do they feel about that situation? How would they want to feel in the future? What is the lesson? How can they make a different choice in the future? So to take an example, if one teenager had a bad experience with maybe a member of the opposite sex who hasn't asked for consent in a certain situation, instead of saying, well, I told you so, you shouldn't date boys because they are bad for you, you can talk about the fact that, yes, it's really important to know about consent and being verbal when giving consent and making sure that you have your boundaries really high and standards quite high. Again, it's really important that children are made to feel normal when they're having this experience, because this is one of the biggest problems that I see with teenagers and young adults. They somehow come out with this idea that there's something wrong with me, that I'm not normal, whether I want too much sex or I don't want any sex. That kind of seems to make them feel like they're an outcast, that they're not belonging to the rest of the community. And in that period of our life, all we want is acceptance. We want to belong, to be a part of something bigger. In a previous year's talk, I've talked about this, what exactly you need to talk to children before the age of 12, but today I've changed things to be much more specific about this age group. But in reality, we're starting to have feelings of attraction for for other people much earlier than 12. One of my friends whose daughter is like 6 or 7 is very proud that she's had 2 marriage proposals already at the age of 6. Of course, we laugh about these things, we think it's cute, but that shows that children, even as young as 6 or 7, are starting to see gender differences and to basically mimic adult relationships and what they see mommy and daddy doing. So it's okay to start conversations around dating and safe sex quite early. Also, it has been found and proven that kids actually start sexting, by basically talking about sex with each other as early as 9, because of course our society is quite sexualized. So it's really important that you have these conversations to explain to your children that if they send sexually explicit images to another person, they actually can be used against them. This is the essence of the consent talk that I give to these kids. These 2 resources that I've got here, the everybodycurious.com and CoreySilverberg.com, Sex is a Funny Word. This is a book about sex. It's for younger children, but it might give you some information about the sort of conversations that you can have and how to bring this conversation into something that is not too awkward. Now, what's really important in puberty is to establish, like I said, a sense of trust. This is why the whole SCARF model is so important to understand. So if you have not had these kind of conversations with your teen before, and you can recognize that they already have a negative association with the word of sex, it's time to turn a new leaf. You actually need to say to your children, look, you are now a certain age. I really would like us to start having a more equal conversation, more balanced conversation. I trust you. You are now a teenager. Things are happening in your life. So our relationship has reached a new milestone. So what we're trying to do at this point is rebalance a little bit the energy of the relationship. When our children are young, we are the ultimate authority. We told them what's right or what's wrong. We're educating them on everything. But as your teen grows a little bit older, they need to start establishing their own sense of self and their own sense of autonomy. And if you keep telling them what to do and put them in their place all the time, if you keep judging them, if you give them lectures and hidden criticisms, they're not going to learn to trust you. In fact, they're going to go away from you. So even comments like, oh, why can't you be the perfect little girl you used to be, or don't be like that girl, or, oh, if only you lost a few kilos, you would be perfect. You may not notice these as criticism, but these are actual quotes from children that I've worked with who have left a really deep scar in their mind. So another way that you can start building this conversation is really ask questions about, what is happening in their friend's life. Are their friends dating? How they're handling relationship? Are they struggling with anything? Do they have any questions? Do they have conversations that maybe they don't have any answers to and that you could help with? It is for reasons of relatedness that I mentioned earlier on. it's actually quite powerful to share some of your own experiences with dating when you were a teen, because children really find it very difficult to imagine that we've been through the same thing as they have. So they think, oh, you never understand me, you're an old person, you cannot get this. But if you talk about your own struggles when you were a child, they will, or a teenager, they will actually start seeing you differently, more like an equal. So they will perceive you less as a threat. Of course, it is very important that you encourage them to continue to stay safe and reassure them that, you know, they need to figure out what is okay for themselves, what makes them feel safe, so they don't have to jump into the sex bandwagon just because it's the way to go, but other people are doing it. So very quickly, I'll kind of recap here some of the communication tips that I've shared. So there are a lot of basically using the environment that you and your child are in as an opportunity to discuss values, perceptions, basically educate your children, understand how they're thinking, how they're feeling about it. Make sure that you're explaining that respect, consent, trust, and open communication are fundamental things that they need to learn to practice in their relationship, and these have to come from you, but you have to demonstrate these. Of course, most of the time you yourself are going to find yourself uncomfortable or not quite sure how to answer certain questions. I know I've had questions in the past about this whole non-binary. Your child suddenly starts calling themselves them, they, and you just don't understand how that works. Well, work with your child to understand their perspective on it. You know, sometimes they educate us on things that we don't know yet, and it's okay to have it as a two-way street. A really, really important conversation to be had about sex, I'm going to go talk a little bit about in a bit, is really what sex really is. Very often children get this idea as adults that, and the same for adults, I mean, that sex is about penetration, that if other forms of sexual interaction do not count. So I've had teenagers telling me, oh, I've never had sex before, but yeah, you know, it's quite often that this my boyfriend is fingering me. So they don't understand that also it's not the fact whether, you know, that's right or wrong. The point is, what they really need to understand, that any sexual behavior of any kind, they need to be comfortable with it, and they need to have clear boundaries around it and give informed consent. Because if they don't, and they somehow minimize that experience, dismissing it as non-sexual, it might actually traumatize them. And, you know, our job as parents is to make sure that our children are safe and learn how to keep themselves safe. Another very important point that we need to communicate is that sexual attraction does not equal love. Yes, in our world, we think that, you know, if we're just into someone immediately, that's love and it's going to last a lifetime, especially in puberty when hormones are raging in teenagers. They might think that if they're sexually attracted to another person, they are then, you know, crazily in love with them, and they have to do whatever the other person is asking them to do so they don't get rejected. But if we educate our children that love is not just this chemistry, but there's attachment, there's friendship, there's other things that matter to create relationships, that's going to be a really important aspect that they need to learn from you. Also very important to really pay attention to what your teen is not telling you. They're going to hide things, they're going to be awkward about it, they're going to have secrets, and that's okay. But you as an adult, as someone who can actually read body language a bit better, or also the things, you know, people sometimes tell you more by not telling you certain things. So pay attention to what is not said in a conversation. Stay objective and make sure that if you're not reacting emotionally, your child will also not feel judged or criticized and will not get defensive. So stick to the facts, just ask questions, but be careful not to ask the question, why? Oh, why are you doing this? Why can't you be more like this? Because the question why actually implies judgment, implies that I know better, you're doing something wrong. So you can ask, instead of asking, why did you do this, which, you know, has this undercurrent, or you shouldn't have done, is, oh, what motivated you? What were you trying to achieve by doing a certain thing? That really helps remove this, this idea of judgment. It's very important to encourage ongoing conversation. Like I said, not one talk, but talking about sex, reassuring your child or teenager that you are there for them to answer all the questions, and really start with educating yourself. If your teen is not willing to have these conversations, I would encourage you to share resources like articles. There are lots of articles out there that answer these kind of questions. So by you looking for that thing and using your adult judgment to find the right kind of information that is in alignment with your own value and what you're trying to explain to your children, then that will really help them figure out what's going on. So I'm almost done. I have 3 more slides here, which I'm going to put on the screen, and maybe you can really explore them in our questions. So essentially, what's important for us to talk about is body and sex positivity. So the conversation with your teen around physiological changes, physical changes, can create a lot of doubt and fear and insecurity. So your child needs to have you there as a sounding board to know that they are okay, that everything that is happening for them is absolutely normal. So all of these things that maybe we've forgotten about as adults, you know, the first period, the first erection, the first crush, they can be extremely traumatizing for a child if they are unprepared and if you create the wrong association. So make sure that you are constantly supporting and openly discussing this with your child, asking them how they're feeling about themselves, because remember how your teen feels about themselves is a reflection of the messages that they receive from others. So being positive in these conversations is really, really important, and avoiding making jokes about their body shape, about their sexuality or anything like that is really, really important, because they will feel extremely self-conscious. I see this in a lot of teens and adults. Key conversation about porn, because I know many of the questions that I've received were about porn. So the most important message that I think really needs to be transmitted to teenagers is that what they see in porn isn't real life, and it's not how relationships actually work. This is really the most fundamental information they need to receive. Being able to separate that stuff, which is all performance, it's about actors, you know, following a script, not something that they need to do or that is the norm in relationships. The very, very important part is trying not to, even though you feel uncomfortable with porn and maybe you never watch it and you don't know what's going on, when you have this conversation, maybe you discover that your children are watching porn, it's very important not to make them feel guilty, to recognize that, you know, it's normal in the sense that it's everywhere, it's ubiquitous, it's available. And if you make them feel guilty or you make them feel ashamed, that will only drive them to try it more, because, you know, forbidden fruit. So what really is important to be communicated is to know that they can actually become addicted to it, that it can damage their attitude and their ability to really enjoy sex. So if you don't know how to start this conversation, of course, the earlier that you can communicate that on the internet, there's going to be a lot of adult stuff and a lot of kid stuff. And when you're actually blocking certain aspects of the World Wide Web is because you are trying to protect them and only focus them on the kids' content. But the entry point, if you like, that I've used many times is to talk to a teenager, to say, simply acknowledge the fact that porn is out there. Instead of judging them for it, to say, look, you may see porn at some point, I know, but here's a few things that you need to know about it. This whole idea that it's performance, is acting a script, is not sex education, and it's not how relationships work. Try to communicate as much as possible that real sex is about connection, intimacy, respect, giving each other pleasure. It's an equal give and take. What they see maybe in porn is that all that matters is size. It's about a person getting what they want. It's about, you know, a little bit of violence sometimes, that people are perfect, what they see in pornography. All of these things are really important conversations. And I would say one of the best ways to start this conversation with your children is actually to watch the Netflix show Sex Education, because a lot of the themes that your children are struggling with are absolutely beautifully portrayed there. The struggles of the parents, the struggles with identity, the struggle with masturbation and sexuality and so on. That show is an absolute gold mine, truly sex education for everyone. So you can look here in the document that I will send over for the specific details. And the last slide before we start going into questions is really the big conversation about masturbation, because it's extremely likely that you're going to find out or suspect that your child is masturbating. And you kind of need to be okay with it, because this is something that even animals do, not just people. It starts much earlier than you think, sometimes around as young as 2 years old. It's exactly the same as chewing toes. It's a child experiencing their body. And that for those reasons that I mentioned before, is that we keep seeking pleasure and we go away from pain. The more you try to make them feel guilty and shame, the more they're actually going to be, let's say, traumatized, or they will have negative associations with this, and that will impact their adult sex life, which is obviously something that we don't want to do, because we want our children to grow up as strong and powerful. So now I'm ready to receive your questions. And while the questions maybe are coming in, I just want to talk a little bit about this whole context, maybe how to talk about body positivity and pleasure. So one of my favorite ways of discussing with teenagers about this is explaining that sex and pleasure, self-pleasure or pleasure with someone else, is just like eating a cake. So the more we eat a nice yummy cake, of course, the more we want of it, right? We're essentially wired to want sweet, pleasurable things. But just as there are lots of other activities that give us pleasure, we're not going to eat a whole birthday cake. We're going to eat a slice of that cake, even though we want a little bit more. We have this capacity for conscious control. And that same principle, that same circuit in our brain, if you like, needs to be engaged when we talk about masturbation, pornography use, and so on. It's really it's a good analogy for children to really understand what is really going on in that space. So am I gonna get the questions on the chat, or are
yeah, thank you so much, Valentina. I got so engrossed in what you were saying that even I lost track of time there. But we are at 7 o'clock.
Yes,
no questions submitted in the Q&A, but as you're leaving, obviously, if you have any questions, we can send that out as a Q&A afterwards. But I was just going to say, communicating with teens has been a common thread throughout all our webinars, and I hope that the frameworks that Valentina has shared this evening will either give you a starting point or kind of the next step on exploring sex and sexuality with your teens, and the importance of these conversations for teens to develop their own identity, values, respect, boundaries, and the main thing that I'm taking away is in order to keep them safe. So thank you so much for this evening.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I will send everything through, and if there are any other questions that I can answer later, I'd be very happy to do so. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for your time,
Thank
everyone.
you, parents.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye. See you.